A nanny was hired to take care of the millionaire's son. But when she arrived at the house, she was frozen in shock upon seeing that the millionaire was her husband, who had been presumed dead for 7 years. Lauren adjusted her purse strap over her shoulder, her heart pounding as she walked up the grand stone steps of the mansion. The towering columns and intricate iron gates of the Newport Beach estate made her feel small, but she squared her shoulders and took a deep breath. It was just another job, a well-paid one. At that, she had been working as a nanny for years, and this was no different, except it was. She had no idea who the employer was. The agency had only given her a name, Mr. Blackwood. No first name, no personal details, just a ridiculously high salary, and the information that the child she'd be caring for was 6 years old. A boy named Caleb, that was enough for her to accept. Lauren had learned to survive, after losing Brandon, the love of her life. 7 years ago, in that tragic boating accident, she had been forced to rebuild from the ground up, pregnant and alone. She had struggled, but she had never given up. And now, she was here, standing in front of an opportunity that could finally give her and her son, Ethan, some much-needed stability. She knocked on the heavy oak door, exhaling slowly to calm herself. Within seconds, a butler, an actual butler, opened it. His demeanor was formal, though his eyes softened when he looked at her. "You must be Miss Carter," he said. "Right this way." She stepped inside, and the air smelled of polished wood, expensive cologne, and something faintly sweet, like vanilla. The mansion was breathtaking, with marble floors and sweeping staircases, but she barely had time to take it in before she heard the sound of little feet rushing toward her. A boy with dark hair and bright blue eyes skidded to a stop in front of her. "You're my new nanny?" he asked, tilting his head. Lauren blinked, her heart skipping a beat. There was something about those eyes, something eerily familiar. "I guess I am," she said with a small smile. "You must be Caleb." The boy grinned. "Yeah, can you make spaghetti? I love spaghetti." "I make the best spaghetti in the world," she assured him. Though her voice felt distant, she was still reeling from the odd familiarity in his features. He reminded her of someone, but she couldn't quite place it. Before she could dwell on it, a deep voice cut through the air, sending a shiver down her spine. "Caleb, what did I say about running in the house?" Lauren froze. That voice. It was impossible. She turned slowly, her breath hitching in her throat, and there he was, standing at the top of the staircase, looking down at her. Brandon. Her world tilted. He was alive. Lauren's breath came in short, panicked bursts as she stared at the man she had mourned for 7 years. He looked the same. Strong, confident, breathtakingly handsome. But there was something different in his eyes. He wasn't looking at her with recognition. He didn't know who she was. "Sorry, Dad," Caleb mumbled, glancing at Lauren before turning back to the man at the top of the stairs. "This is my new nanny." Lauren felt like she was drowning. Brandon descended the stairs, his movements graceful and sure. His gaze locked on her. "Miss Carter, I presume?" The formality in his tone was a knife to her chest. Lauren swallowed, trying to steady herself. Yes," he nodded, extending a hand. "Brandon Blackwood. Blackwood. Not Brandon Carter. Not the man she had loved." Lauren's mind was spinning. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. She hesitated, then took his hand. The warmth of his skin sent a shock through her. He was real, solid, alive. "Nice to meet you," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Brandon studied her, his blue eyes sharp. "The agency spoke highly of you. Caleb can be a handful, but I'm sure you'll manage." Lauren nodded stiffly, her heart pounding. "Of course!" Brandon gave her a curt nod, and then turned to Caleb. "Behave for Miss Carter." Caleb rolled his eyes. Yeah. Brandon's lips twitched in amusement before he walked away, disappearing down a hallway. Lauren stood frozen, her body trembling. He didn't recognize her. The man she had loved, the father of her child, had no idea who she was. And worse, her gaze shifted back to Caleb, who was now tugging at her sleeve, grinning. Something in her gut twisted violently, because now that the shock had settled, she knew exactly why he looked familiar. Those eyes, they weren't just Brandon's. They were Ethan's. Her world shattered all over again. Lauren forced herself to breathe. The polished floors beneath her feet felt unsteady, the walls of the grand mansion closing in. Every fiber of her being screamed that this wasn't possible, that the man who had held her in his arms, whispered promises of forever, and then disappeared into the ocean, could not be standing right in front of her. But he was, and he had no idea who she was. Caleb tugged at her sleeve again, his bright blue eyes searching her face with curiosity. "Are you okay?" Lauren blinked, snapping out of the daze that threatened to consume her. She had to stay calm. Whatever was happening here, however twisted, surreal, and heartbreaking, it wasn't the time to break down. "I'm fine," she said, forcing a smile. "Just a little surprised. This place is really big." Caleb's grin returned, completely unaware of the storm raging inside her. "It's awesome, right? There's a pool, a game room, and even a movie theater." Lauren nodded numbly, but her mind was racing. Caleb, Brandon, Blackwood. Her gaze flickered toward the hallway where Brandon had disappeared, and her chest tightened painfully. He wasn't Brandon Carter anymore. The man she had loved, the father of her child, was now living under a different name, in a different world. And somehow, in that world, Caleb existed. She needed answers. She could not fall apart now. Caleb grabbed her hand, pulling her down the hallway. "Come on, I'll show you my room." Lauren hesitated, but what choice did she have? If she left now, she might never get another chance to understand what had happened. She followed him down a corridor adorned with expensive paintings, her pulse quickening with every step. Caleb's room was huge, bigger than the entire apartment she and Ethan shared. There were toys scattered around, superhero posters on the walls, and a bookshelf filled with children's stories. It was warm and inviting, filled with life, and yet something felt off. She had been a nanny for years. She had worked in countless homes, taken care of children from all sorts of families, but there was a sterility here, a hollowness beneath the carefully placed comforts. "Do you like it?" Caleb asked, flopping onto his bed. Lauren nodded. "It's amazing," he shrugged. "Yeah, I guess. But it's kind of boring when it's just me and Mrs. Vanessa." The name sent a chill through her. Vanessa. Her heart pounded. Who was she? The thought of another woman in Brandon's life made her stomach twist. But there was no time to dwell on that now. "Your mom?" Lauren asked. Carefully watching his reaction, Caleb made a face. "Not really. Dad says she takes care of me, but she's not my real mom. I don't remember my real mom." Lauren's breath hitched, her fingers clenched at her sides. She knew better than to ask too much too soon, but the ache in her chest grew unbearable. Before she could respond, a voice cut through the room like ice. "I hope you're settling in well." Lauren turned sharply, her stomach tightening as a tall, elegant woman entered the room. Vanessa. She was stunning. Dark hair pulled into a sleek ponytail, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit that screamed money and power. But her eyes, cold, calculating, possessive. A shiver ran down Lauren's spine. "I'm Vanessa," the woman said smoothly, offering a polite but detached smile. "I handle most of Caleb's affairs. You'll report directly to me." Lauren forced a neutral expression. "Nice to meet you." Vanessa's gaze was sharp as she studied her. "Caleb, sweetheart, why don't you run downstairs and get a snack? I need a moment with Miss Carter." Caleb hesitated, but eventually nodded, hopping off the bed and running past them. The second he was gone, Vanessa stepped closer. Lauren held her ground. "I have to admit, I was surprised when Brandon hired you," Vanessa said, her voice silky but dripping with warning. "We're very selective about who we let near Caleb." Lauren kept her expression unreadable. "I was told I was chosen because of my experience," Vanessa smirked. "Experience, yes, but also luck, I suppose." Lauren's fingers twitched. She could feel the unspoken threat hanging between them. "Brandon doesn't usually make impulsive decisions," Vanessa continued, "which makes me wonder, what is it about you that made him change his mind?" Lauren's heart pounded. She could not let Vanessa see her unravel. "I'm just here to do my job," she said evenly. "Nothing more." Vanessa tilted her head, watching her like a predator assessing prey. "I certainly hope so," she murmured, "because Brandon and Caleb are my family, and I don't like disruptions." A warning, A clear, unmistakable warning. Lauren clenched her jaw, keeping her face neutral. But inside, the fire had been lit. She had lost Brandon once. She had lost her child once now. She was standing in the middle of a lie so twisted it made her sick. And if Vanessa thought she could intimidate her into walking away, she was dead wrong. Lauren lifted her chin, holding Vanessa's gaze without flinching. "Of course," she said smoothly. "I wouldn't dream of disrupting anything." But in that moment, Lauren knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going anywhere. Lauren barely slept that night. She lay awake in the small guest room she had been given, staring at the ceiling, her mind a tangled mess of memories and unanswered questions. Brandon was alive. Caleb might be her son. And Vanessa, she was dangerous. That much was clear. Lauren had encountered controlling parents before, clients who hovered, dictated every aspect of their child's life. But this was something entirely different. The cold possessiveness in Vanessa's eyes, the veiled threat in her voice. It wasn't just about keeping Caleb in line. It was about keeping secrets buried. Lauren turned onto her side, exhaling shakily. She had to stay focused. She couldn't let emotions cloud her judgment. Not yet. If Caleb was really her child, then how had he ended up here? What had really happened the night Brandon disappeared? She needed proof. She needed the truth, and she had no choice but to play along until she found it. The next morning, Lauren was already downstairs when Caleb came running into the kitchen, his hair tousled from sleep, still wearing his dinosaur pajamas. "Morning," he said, flashing her a toothy grin. Lauren's heart clenched, so much like Ethan. "Good morning, buddy," she replied, keeping her voice light. "Hungry," he nodded eagerly, climbing onto one of the stools at the marble island. "Pancakes," coming right up. As she moved around the kitchen, grabbing ingredients, she felt a presence behind her. Brandon. She froze, gripping the carton of eggs a little tighter before turning around. He stood in the doorway, dressed sharply in a navy suit, looking like the definition of success and control. His blue eyes, however, held a flicker of something else. Curiosity. Lauren's stomach twisted. He had no idea who she was. "Morning," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant. Lauren swallowed hard. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood." Something flashed in his gaze. A brief moment of discomfort at the formality, but he didn't correct her. Instead, he moved further into the kitchen, grabbing a cup of coffee. "Caleb, I want you to behave for Miss Carter," he said, his tone fatherly but distant. "I'll be working late today." Caleb sighed dramatically. "You always work late." Brandon's jaw tightened, but he ruffled Caleb's hair. "I'll make it up to you this weekend." Lauren observed the exchange carefully. There was warmth in Brandon's voice, but there was also a barrier, a distance, as if he was going through the motions but not fully present. Was it because of the memory loss? Or was it because, deep down, something felt wrong to him too? Brandon turned his attention to Lauren. "If you need anything, talk to Vanessa." Lauren's stomach clenched. She forced a polite nod. "Of course," for a second. Just a fraction of a second. He hesitated. His eyes searched her face, a flicker of something in his expression. Recognition, doubt. But then, just as quickly, it was gone. He nodded once and left, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. Lauren let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She turned back to Caleb, who was watching her curiously. "You're staring at my dad a lot," he said matter-of-factly. Her heart stuttered. Lauren forced a chuckle. "He just reminds me of someone I used to know." Caleb tilted his head. "Oh, a good someone or a bad someone?" Lauren swallowed. "A very good someone." Caleb nodded, satisfied, and dug into his pancakes. Lauren's hands trembled as she flipped another batch. She was running out of time. She had to know. That afternoon, while Caleb was in his tutoring session, Lauren locked herself in the guest room with her laptop. She typed furiously, "Brandon Carter missing case." News articles filled the screen. She skimmed through them, her breath quickening. Reports from 7 years ago, detailing the boating accident off the California coast, the search efforts, the wreckage found, the assumption that he had drowned, but nothing about him being found, nothing about him becoming Brandon Blackwood. Lauren clenched her fists. Someone erased that part of his life. Her fingers flew across the keyboard again. Caleb Blackwood adoption records. A second later, her stomach dropped. The adoption papers were sealed. Her breath came in short gasps. Why would they be sealed unless they were hiding something? Lauren's pulse pounded as she stared at the screen. She needed access to those records. She needed proof. And the only person who had it was Vanessa. Later that night, after dinner, Vanessa found her. Lauren had just finished tucking Caleb in when she turned. And there she was, standing in the dimly lit hallway. A chill ran down Lauren's spine. Vanessa smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Taking your job seriously, I see." Lauren forced a polite smile. "Of course. Caleb's a great kid." Vanessa stepped closer. "Brandon likes efficiency. He values loyalty." Lauren swallowed. What was she implying? Vanessa's smile tightened. "I trust we won't have any misunderstandings." Lauren held her ground. She was done pretending. "Of course not," she said evenly. "I'm here to take care of Caleb, nothing more." Vanessa studied her, then leaned in slightly. "Good," she whispered, "because people who ask too many questions tend to disappear." Lauren's blood turned to ice. Vanessa knew. She knew Lauren was digging. And she was warning her to back off, but Vanessa had no idea who she was dealing with. Lauren's fear melted into something stronger, determination. She wasn't walking away. She was just getting started. Lauren didn't sleep that night. Vanessa's words echoed in her head. People who ask too many questions tend to disappear. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Lauren lay stiffly in bed, staring at the ceiling. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Vanessa wasn't just protecting a secret. She was willing to destroy anyone who got too close to uncovering it. The stakes had just changed. This wasn't just about Brandon's memory loss or Caleb's true identity anymore. This was about danger. And if she wasn't careful, she could lose everything. Lauren exhaled slowly, gripping the sheets. She had to play this smart. She couldn't confront Vanessa. Not yet. She needed proof. Something undeniable. Something that would shatter whatever grip Vanessa had over Brandon. And she needed to act fast. The next morning, Lauren stepped into the kitchen, forcing herself to appear calm, composed. Vanessa was already there, sipping coffee like a queen surveying her kingdom. She gave Lauren a slow, knowing smile. "Sleep well?" she asked, her voice dripping with mock concern. Lauren smiled back, just as coldly. "Like a baby," Vanessa chuckled, setting her cup down. "Good. I was just telling Brandon how impressed I am with your work. Caleb seems to like you." Lauren's stomach twisted. The casual way Vanessa spoke, as if she hadn't delivered a thinly veiled warning the night before, made Lauren's skin crawl. Before she could respond, Brandon entered the kitchen. Lauren's breath caught. He was wearing another sharp suit, his presence effortlessly commanding. But this time, when he looked at her, there was something different in his expression. Curiosity, recognition, no, confusion, like he was trying to place a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. Lauren's pulse quickened. Was he starting to remember? Brandon cleared his throat. "Miss Carter, can I speak with you for a moment?" Vanessa's smile faltered for half a second, just long enough for Lauren to notice. Lauren forced a nod. "Of course." Brandon led her to his office. A sleek, modern space lined with shelves of law books and expensive-looking decor. He gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing. She needed to be in control of this conversation. Brandon leaned against his desk, arms crossed. "Vanessa tells me you're doing well with Caleb." Lauren nodded. "He's a great kid." Brandon studied her for a long moment. "You seem familiar." Lauren's stomach flipped. She forced herself to breathe. I get that a lot." Brandon's brow furrowed slightly. "Have we met before?" Her heart pounded. For 7 years, she had dreamed of hearing those words. But now, with Vanessa lurking in the shadows, manipulating everything, she couldn't risk pushing him too soon. She needed him to remember on his own. So she swallowed the lump in her throat and shook her head. "I don't think so," she said, her voice steady. "Maybe I just remind you of someone." Brandon exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Maybe." He didn't sound convinced. A crack in the armor. Before he could question her further, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, then sighed. "I have a meeting. If Caleb needs anything, let Vanessa know." Lauren nodded. stepping toward the door. But then, "Miss Carter," she froze. When she turned, his blue eyes were still on her, studying her like a riddle he couldn't solve. "Never mind," he murmured. Lauren forced herself to leave, even though her legs felt weak. She was getting to him. That afternoon, while Caleb was playing outside, Lauren took a risk. She slipped into Brandon's office. Her heart pounded as she scanned the bookshelves, the desk, the drawers. Vanessa had control over him, but she couldn't possibly control everything. There had to be something here. She checked his files, but most were business-related. She was about to give up when she noticed a locked drawer. Bingo. She yanked it, but it wouldn't budge. Her hands trembled as she looked around. The key had to be somewhere. Her eyes landed on a decorative globe on his desk. She picked it up, twisting it. Click. The bottom popped open. Inside, a small silver key. Lauren grabbed it, exhaling sharply. She turned back to the drawer, slid the key into the lock, and footsteps. She shoved the key into her pocket and slammed the drawer shut just as the door swung open. Vanessa. Lauren's blood ran cold. Vanessa leaned against the door frame, arms crossed, a knowing smirk on her lips. Looking for something, Lauren forced a neutral expression. "Just tidying up." Vanessa chuckled. "You're not a maid, sweetheart." Lauren clenched her jaw. "Just trying to be helpful." Vanessa took a step closer. "I told you not to ask too many questions." Lauren didn't blink. "I'm not." Vanessa's smile vanished. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. A silent war. Then, Vanessa exhaled. "Good." She turned on her heel, but not before delivering one last warning. "Remember, Miss Carter, you work for us. Not the other way around." And with that, she was gone. Lauren's heart was pounding so hard it hurt. She slowly reached into her pocket, fingers brushing the small silver key. Vanessa knew she was looking, which meant Lauren had just become a real threat, but it was too late to stop now. Lauren sat in the dim light of her guest room, the small silver key resting on her palm. Her fingers curled around it. This was it, her first real chance at uncovering the truth. But after her close call with Vanessa, she had to be careful. She had been playing defense, dodging Vanessa's threats and Brandon's uncertainty. Now, it was time to strike back. She had to find out what was in that locked drawer, but she needed the perfect moment. And until then, she had to act normal. At breakfast the next morning, she did just that. Caleb sat at the counter, happily munching on toast. Lauren stood by the stove, flipping eggs, her expression calm, across from her. Vanessa sipped her coffee, watching her with sharp eyes. Lauren didn't react. She didn't flinch. She had learned how to play the game. Brandon walked in a moment later, already dressed for work, adjusting the cuffs of his sleeves. Lauren kept her eyes trained on the pan, not daring to look at him too long, because if she did, she might lose control. "Mornin', Dad," Caleb said with a mouthful of toast. Brandon chuckled, ruffling his hair. "Mornin', buddy." His gaze flickered toward Lauren. "Miss Carter." She turned, her face neutral. "Mr. Blackwood." Something passed between them. A hesitation, like he wanted to say more. Lauren held her breath, waiting, but then, "Vanessa, I'll be home late tonight," Brandon said, breaking whatever moment had been forming. "Board meeting." Vanessa smiled. "Of course. I'll make sure everything is taken care of." Lauren forced herself to breathe. Tonight, Brandon would be gone. This was her chance. That evening, after Caleb had fallen asleep, Lauren waited. The house was quiet. Brandon was still at his meeting. Vanessa was in her suite upstairs. Now, heart pounding, Lauren crept down the hallway, slipping into Brandon's office. She moved fast, heading straight for the locked drawer. She slid the key into place. Click! The drawer unlocked. Her fingers trembled as she pulled it open. Inside, there were stacks of files. She rifled through them, her pulse racing. Business documents, contracts. Nothing important then. A small manila envelope at the bottom. Her hands shook as she picked it up. She opened it and felt her world collapse. Inside was a birth certificate, Caleb's birth certificate, her son's birth certificate. Lauren's breath came in shaky gasps as she scanned the document. Mother, unknown, father, Brandon Blackwood, date of birth. 6 years ago, 6 years. The same age as Ethan, the same age as the child who had been stolen from her arms. She gripped the paper so tightly it crumpled in her hands. Oh my God. Caleb wasn't just Brandon's son. He was her son too. Vanessa had stolen him. A broken sob tore from her throat. Everything made sense now. The sealed adoption records. The way Caleb had no memory of his real mother. The way Vanessa controlled everything. This was why. Lauren was his mother. Tears blurred her vision as she tried to breathe, tried to process the weight of the truth. Her child. The baby she had cried for. The baby she had mourned. He was right here, under the same roof as her, and he didn't even know. She had to get out. She shoved the papers back, locked the drawer, and stumbled out of the office, her chest tight. She needed air. She needed to think. She needed to get her son back. Lauren barely noticed where she was going. She stepped outside, the cool night air hitting her skin, but it wasn't enough. The panic still clung to her, suffocating her, breaking her apart. Then, a voice. Miss Carter. She froze. Slowly. She turned. Brandon stood a few feet away, his tie loosened, his expression unreadable. He was back. Lauren's stomach dropped. "What are you doing out here?" he asked, stepping closer. Lauren struggled to find words, her mind still reeling from what she had just discovered. I just needed some air," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Brandon studied her, too closely. "You look like you've seen a ghost." She forced a laugh. "Just a long day." Another pause. Then, to her surprise, he sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "I know the feeling," he muttered. Something in his voice caught her off guard. It wasn't just tiredness. It was something deeper. Something almost haunted. Her pulse quickened. "Are you okay?" she asked, before she could stop herself. Brandon let out a dry laugh. "You know, I don't think anyone's asked me that in a long time." Lauren's breath caught. His words were so raw, so unguarded, that it shattered something inside her. The man she loved was still in there, buried under lies, manipulation, and missing memories. But he was still there, and now she had proof that they had a son together. The question was, how was she going to tell him? Lauren could barely keep her hands from trembling. The birth certificate was still burned into her mind. Mother, unknown. But she knew the truth now. Caleb was her son, and Brandon. She stole a glance at him, standing there in the dim light of the garden, his tie loosened, exhaustion shadowing his face. There was something in his eyes, an emptiness, a longing. He might not remember their past, but part of him felt it, felt her. Lauren opened her mouth, the words balanced on the edge of her tongue. "Caleb is ours. Vanessa stole him from me." But she hesitated, telling him now, without proof, without a plan. Would be suicidal? Vanessa still controlled everything, and if she realized that Lauren knew the truth, she'd find a way to bury it. Bury her. Lauren inhaled deeply, forcing her voice to stay steady. "Maybe you should ask yourself that question." Brandon blinked. "What? You asked if I was okay," she said softly. "But what about you?" A muscle ticked in his jaw. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, with a dry chuckle, he shoved his hands into his pockets. "I don't know," he admitted, shaking his head. "Lately, something feels off." Lauren's heart clenched. It was happening. The cracks were forming. Before she could press further, the patio door slid open. Lauren's stomach dropped. Vanessa. She stood there, perfectly composed, dressed in a silk robe, her expression unreadable. But her eyes were sharp. "Darling," she purred, stepping out into the night. "I thought you'd be asleep by now." Brandon exhaled. "Couldn't sleep." Vanessa's gaze flickered to Lauren, her lips curling into a polite but pointed smile. "How sweet of Miss Carter to keep you company," she said smoothly. Lauren's skin prickled. There it was again. The warning. Vanessa wasn't just threatened. She was watching. Lauren forced an easy smile. "I was just getting some air before heading to bed." Vanessa nodded, but the look in her eyes said everything. Lauren was straying too close to dangerous territory, and Vanessa knew it. The next morning, Vanessa called a house meeting. Lauren arrived in the living room, her stomach tight with unease. Brandon sat on the couch, rubbing his temple like he had a headache. Caleb was on the floor, playing with a toy car. Vanessa stood beside the fireplace, a picture of calm control. "I wanted to take a moment to check in," she said smoothly. "Brandon's been under a lot of stress at work, and Caleb's well-being is our top priority." Lauren knew better than to think this was about a simple check-in. Vanessa's eyes flickered toward her. "That's why I think it would be best if we set some boundaries moving forward." Lauren's pulse spiked. Brandon sighed. "Vanessa, I don't." She placed a hand on his shoulder, cutting him off effortlessly. "Brandon, darling, you trust me to handle these things. Don't you?" Lauren gritted her teeth. It was a test, a way to remind Brandon where his loyalty was supposed to lie. Brandon hesitated. Then he nodded. "Of course." Lauren clenched her fists. Vanessa smiled. "Wonderful." She turned back to Lauren. "From now on, I'd like you to keep your focus solely on Caleb. No late-night walks. No unnecessary conversations with Brandon." Lauren's blood boiled. Vanessa was trying to cut her off, trying to erase her before she became a real problem. Lauren kept her voice calm. "If that's what you prefer." But in her mind, she was already planning. If Vanessa was tightening her grip, it meant she was scared, and scared people made mistakes. That night, Lauren took her next risk. She waited until everyone was asleep. Then, carefully, she snuck into Brandon's office again. The key to the locked drawer was already in her pocket. She turned it slowly. Click. This time, she didn't just take the birth certificate. She grabbed everything: a stack of papers, a folder marked Blackwood Holdings Private Records, a USB drive tucked in the back. She shoved them into a bag, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. She had to move fast. She needed to scan these, copy them, do whatever it took to get proof that Vanessa had stolen her child. But as she turned, a shadow moved in the doorway. Her breath froze. Vanessa, standing there, eyes dark with something terrifyingly calm. Lauren's stomach twisted. How long had she been watching? Vanessa tilted her head. "I should have known." Lauren's heart pounded. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said smoothly. Slipping the papers behind her back, Vanessa smirked. "Oh, Lauren," she murmured, stepping closer. "You really should have stayed in your place." Lauren's blood ran cold. Vanessa didn't yell. She didn't threaten. She just smiled, like she had already won. Then, she stepped aside, and 2 security guards entered the office. Lauren's breath hitched. "No, no, no, no." Vanessa's voice was like silk. "You're fired." Lauren's world spun. Everything happened too fast. One of the guards reached for her arm, but she jerked away. "You can't do this." Vanessa laughed softly. "Oh, sweetheart, I already have." Lauren's stomach dropped. She had to think. She had to stall. I need to say goodbye to Caleb," she said quickly. Vanessa's eyes glinted. "That won't be necessary." Lauren's chest ached. Vanessa was ripping her away from her own son. The guards grabbed her arms. Lauren fought, but they were stronger. They dragged her out. Her vision blurred as she stumbled through the halls. She had just started to feel like home, and in the distance, she heard Caleb's voice, sleepy, confused. "Lauren." Her heart broke. She screamed his name, but before she could reach him, the door slammed shut in her face, and she was thrown out into the night. Lauren stood on the curb, the night air biting cold against her skin. The mansion's massive iron gates had already closed behind her, locking her out. She had fought, screamed, begged, but it hadn't mattered. Vanessa had won. For now, Lauren's hands clenched into fists. She could still hear Caleb's sleepy, confused voice echoing in her ears. Lauren. Her heart broke all over again. She had been so close. She had the birth certificate, the USB, the files, proof that Caleb was hers. And now they were inside the mansion, out of her reach. She swallowed back the lump in her throat, forcing herself to breathe. "Think, Lauren. Think." Vanessa had cut her off, but that didn't mean she had lost. If anything, this meant Vanessa was terrified. Lauren was getting too close to the truth, and Vanessa knew it. She wouldn't have kicked her out if she didn't see her as a real threat, which meant Lauren still had power, and still had. And she was going to use it. She had nowhere to go. With shaking hands, she pulled out her phone and dialed the only number that mattered. The call rang twice before a sleepy voice answered. "Mom." Lauren closed her eyes. "Ethan." "Hey, baby." she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Mom, are you okay? His voice sharpened with worry. Where are you? Lauren exhaled, gripping the phone tighter. I need to come home. 30 minutes later, Lauren walked into her small apartment. The second she stepped inside, Ethan was there, wide awake despite the late hour, eyes filled with worry. Mom, what happened? He asked. Lauren tried to smile, but she couldn't hold it. Her face crumpled, and in an instant, Ethan wrapped his arms around her. She clung to him, fighting back tears. She had lost one son tonight, but she still had Ethan, and she would fight like hell to get Caleb back. The next morning, Lauren sat at the kitchen table, a cup of untouched coffee in front of her. Ethan sat across from her, watching her carefully. So, are you going to tell me what happened? Lauren swallowed. It's complicated. Ethan leaned back, crossing his arms. Mom, I'm not a kid. Lauren hesitated, then sighed. I found something, Ethan. Something big. His brows furrowed. What? Lauren took a breath, steadying herself. Caleb. He's not just some kid I was taking care of. Ethan's eyes widened. What do you mean? Lauren's throat tightened. He's your brother. Silence. Ethan just stared at her. What? He whispered. Lauren forced herself to say it out loud. Caleb is the baby I lost. The one I thought had died. Vanessa took him. She raised him as her own. Ethan's face paled. Are you sure? Lauren nodded. I found his birth certificate, but Vanessa kicked me out before I could do anything. Ethan's hands clenched into fists. She stole him from us. Lauren's voice shook. Yes. Ethan's jaw tightened. Then we get him back. Lauren blinked at him. Ethan's eyes burned with determination, his father's stubbornness shining through. Lauren's chest ached. She had lost Brandon, lost the chance to raise both of their children together. But in that moment, she saw it. Brandon lived on in Ethan, and she would not let Vanessa take Caleb from her any longer. Lauren needed help, and there was only one person who could give it. She grabbed her phone and dialed. The voice that answered was sharp, alert. This is Detective Harrison. Lauren's grip tightened. Detective. It's Lauren Carter. A pause, then. Lauren. Detective James Harrison had been the lead investigator 7 years ago. When Brandon had gone missing, he had been the only one who believed something wasn't right. Lauren's heart pounded. I need your help. An hour later, Lauren sat across from Detective Harrison in a small diner. He studied her, his sharp brown eyes unreadable. You look like hell, he said. Lauren let out a dry laugh. I feel worse. Harrison took a sip of coffee. What's going on? Lauren exhaled, then said the words that changed everything. Brandon is alive. Harrison froze. Lauren continued, voice shaking. He's alive, but he doesn't remember me. And Caleb, our son. Vanessa took him. She raised him as hers. Harrison set his cup down. Hard. You're telling me Vanessa Blackwood, Brandon's so-called wife, stole your kid? Lauren nodded. And she erased everything. The adoption files are sealed. Brandon doesn't even know he's not really her son. Harrison let out a long breath, running a hand through his hair. Son of a boo, he muttered. Lauren leaned forward. Can you help me? Harrison's jaw tightened. You really think I'd say no? Relief flooded her. But then, I'll help you. But Lauren, if Vanessa went this far to steal a child, she won't just give up. Lauren's stomach twisted. Harrison's voice was grim. She won't stop until she's destroyed you. Lauren already knew that. She wasn't afraid, because this time, she was fighting back. Lauren stared at Detective Harrison across the diner table, her pulse thundering in her ears. She won't stop until she's destroyed you. His words still echoed in her mind, but she had already made her choice. She wasn't backing down. Lauren had lost too much already. Brandon, Caleb, 7 years of her life, and Vanessa had taken it all. Not anymore. Lauren's hands clenched into fists. Then I'll destroy her first. Harrison raised an eyebrow. That's what I was hoping to hear. They spent the next hour laying out a plan. Vanessa had erased all legal proof of Lauren's connection to Caleb. But she wasn't invincible. There had to be something. A loose thread, a mistake, a hidden record that Vanessa had overlooked. We need to get our hands on those sealed adoption records, Harrison said, flipping through his notes. If we can prove fraud, we can challenge her custody. Lauren nodded. But how do we get them? Harrison leaned back, his eyes sharp. I still have contacts at the county records office. It won't be easy, but I can pull some strings. Lauren's heart pounded. This was it. The first real step toward getting Caleb back. But, Harrison continued, that's only half the battle. We need Brandon on our side. Lauren's stomach twisted. Brandon? The man she had loved, mourned, never stopped longing for. The man who didn't even remember her. He's already doubting things, she admitted. I can feel it, but Vanessa controls him. She's had years to manipulate him. Harrison sighed. That woman is a snake. If we move too soon, she'll convince him you're lying. Lauren swallowed hard. Then we need to make him remember before she can stop him. Harrison gave her a long look. You really still believe he's in there? Lauren didn't hesitate. Yes, because even in those fleeting moments, when his eyes softened, when confusion flickered across his face, she knew Brandon wasn't lost. Not yet, and she would bring him back. That night, Lauren sat on the couch in her apartment, staring at her phone. She had texted Brandon earlier. No response. She exhaled slowly. It was a risk, reaching out to him. If Vanessa found out, she would tighten her grip even more. But she couldn't afford to wait, before she could overthink it. She sent another message. Lauren, I need to talk to you, please. She stared at the screen, waiting. Nothing. Minutes passed. Her chest ached. Had she already lost him completely? Then, Brandon, where? Lauren's breath hitched. She had him, she typed back quickly. Lauren, the docks, 10 p.m., alone. There was a pause. Then, Brandon? Okay. Lauren's hands shook as she set her phone down. This was it, her chance. She wasn't going to waste it. The ocean air was crisp when Lauren arrived at the docks. She pulled her coat tighter around her, nerves twisting in her stomach. She hadn't been here in years. Not since... She swallowed hard. Not since the night Brandon disappeared. The waves crashed softly against the wooden beams, the salty breeze bringing back memories she had spent years trying to bury. Then, footsteps. Her heart pounded as she turned. Brandon stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, his face unreadable, but in his eyes, confusion, hesitation, and something else, something deeper. You're really pushing it, he muttered, stepping closer. Vanessa won't like this. Lauren's jaw tightened. I don't care what Vanessa likes. Brandon exhaled, rubbing his forehead. Lauren, what is this about? She took a shaky breath. Do you trust her? She asked softly. Brandon frowned. What? Vanessa? She pressed. Do you trust her? Brandon hesitated. That tiny hesitation. Lauren clung to it. You don't, do you? She whispered. Brandon looked away, his jaw clenching. I don't know. She's been there for me. She helped me when I had nothing. Lauren's chest ached. Of course he felt that way, because Vanessa had made sure she was the only thing he knew. She's lying to you, Lauren said, her voice breaking. Brandon, you had a life before her, a life she stole. His eyes snapped back to hers. I don't remember, he admitted, frustration creeping into his voice. Lauren stepped closer, her heart pounding. But you feel it, don't you? His breathing hitched, and for a split second, just a fraction of a moment, he looked at her like he knew her, like something inside him was fighting to break free. Lauren reached for his hand, desperation in her touch. We had a life together, Brandon. A family, a son. His face paled. What? Lauren swallowed hard. Caleb, he's our son. Brandon took a step back, shaking his head. No, that doesn't make sense. She could see it in his eyes. The war inside him, the battle between what Vanessa had told him and what his own heart was screaming. I know this is a lot, Lauren whispered, but I swear to you, it's the truth. Brandon ran a hand through his hair, looking completely lost. I need to think, he muttered. Lauren's chest tightened. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. She had planted the seed, and now she could only pray it would grow. Brandon drove through the dark streets of Newport Beach, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. His heart was pounding. Lauren's words kept playing in his head, over and over again. Caleb, he's our son. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. And yet, something inside him was cracking. For years, He had accepted the version of events Vanessa had told him, that he had been in a tragic accident, that she had saved him, that Caleb had needed a father, and Vanessa had taken him in. But there were gaps in his memory, blurry edges, things that never quite made sense. And now Lauren, this woman who felt so painfully familiar, was telling him everything he thought he knew was a lie. Brandon exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple as he pulled into the driveway of his mansion. His head ached. He needed answers, and there was only one person who had them. The house was quiet when he stepped inside. Vanessa was waiting. She sat on the velvet couch, a glass of red wine in her manicured hand, her expression calm but expectant. "You're home late," she said smoothly. Brandon ignored the tightness in his chest. "I was out." Vanessa took a slow sip of her wine, her eyes flickering over him. "With her." Brandon clenched his jaw. "Why didn't you tell me about Lauren?" Vanessa set her glass down with chilling precision. "Brandon," she sighed, shaking her head. "She's manipulating you." His stomach twisted. "Then tell me the truth. Who is she?" Vanessa stood, moving toward him like a shadow slipping through the room. "She's no one," she whispered, placing a hand on his chest. "A desperate woman trying to latch onto your life. She knows who you are now. She knows what you have. Don't you see? She's lying." Brandon wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that everything was as it should be, that he wasn't missing something huge and important. But the doubt had already taken root. He stepped back. "I don't know what to believe." Vanessa's eyes darkened, and for the first time, she slipped. For the first time, the cracks in her mask showed. "Brandon, listen to me," she said sharply. "That woman is dangerous. She got too close to Caleb, and I had to protect him. That's why I fired her." Brandon's breath hitched. She had fired her, not because of anything Lauren did wrong, but because she got too close. His stomach twisted violently. Vanessa saw the shift in his expression, and for the first time, a flicker of something like fear passed through her eyes. She tried to recover, forcing a smile. "Darling, I'm only thinking of what's best for you." Brandon swallowed hard, but for the first time in 7 years, he wasn't sure that was true. The next morning, Vanessa's tight grip on his life felt even more suffocating. Everywhere he turned, she was there, watching, hovering, controlling, and Caleb. Brandon's chest ached as he watched his son from across the breakfast table. Caleb was happy, playful, innocent, but there was something about him that Brandon had never really noticed before. Something that now, after last night, was impossible to ignore. He looked like Lauren, the same shape of her eyes, the same little crease in his brow when he was concentrating. Brandon's pulse sped up. Vanessa had always been so careful about avoiding talk of Caleb's past. She would say things like, "What matters is that he's here now," and he never questioned it. Until now. Brandon inhaled deeply and turned to Caleb. "Hey, buddy," he said, keeping his tone casual. "What do you remember about when you were little?" Caleb barely looked up from his cereal. "Not much." Brandon's throat tightened. Wrote, "Do you remember where you were before you lived here?" Caleb paused mid-bite. Then, Vanessa's voice cut in, sharp and smooth. "He was too young to remember, darling." Brandon's head snapped toward her. She was smiling, but it was too controlled, too perfect. Something inside him snapped. "Let him answer." Vanessa stiffened. Caleb looked between them, suddenly uncomfortable. "I don't really remember anything," he said hesitantly. "I just always lived here, I guess." Brandon's heart dropped. That didn't make sense. There were no childhood stories, no baby pictures, no memories of where he had come from. Nothing. Brandon's breath shook. He had spent years thinking he was the one with a missing past. But now, staring at Caleb's confused face, he realized Caleb's past had been erased, too. He pushed his chair back, his pulse thundering in his ears. "I need to go." Vanessa's face hardened. "Brandon?" He ignored her. Because for the first time in 7 years, his instincts were screaming that something was very, very wrong, and he was finally ready to listen. Brandon parked outside a familiar apartment complex, his hands trembling as he knocked on the door. It opened within seconds. Lauren stood there, eyes wide with shock. And for the first time, Brandon wasn't afraid to ask the question that had been gnawing at him since last night. "Tell me everything." Lauren's breath hitched. And as she pulled him inside, the truth was about to come crashing down. Brandon stepped inside Lauren's apartment, his heart hammering in his chest. The walls felt too close, the air too thick. For the past 7 years, he had lived in certainty, or at least, he had thought he did. But now, that certainty was crumbling beneath him. And Lauren, this woman who felt so familiar it hurt, was the only person who could give him the truth. He needed answers. No more doubts, no more half-truths. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice rough. Lauren stared at him, her lips parted in shock. Then, something in her expression shifted. Not just surprise, but relief, as if she had been waiting for this moment. She stepped aside. "Come in." Brandon sat on the worn-out couch, his hands clasped tightly together. Lauren sat across from him, studying him carefully, as if afraid one wrong word might make him run. He wouldn't. Not anymore. "I don't know where to start," she admitted softly. Brandon exhaled, rubbing his forehead. "Start with the truth." Lauren took a shaky breath. "All right." And then, she told him everything. She told him about the life they had before, the love they shared, the way he had held her close, whispered promises of forever. She told him about the night of the accident, how she had waited, how she had searched for him, how she had cried until there was nothing left. She told him about Caleb, how she had carried their son, believing he would never meet his father, how she had held him for the first time, only for him to be ripped away. Brandon's hands tightened into fists. Every word hit him like a punch to the gut. His head spun, his stomach twisted. "No," he whispered. That can't be right." Lauren's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Brandon, you know it's true. You feel it, don't you?" Brandon's chest ached. Yes, he felt it. But if this was true, if everything he had believed for the past 7 years was a lie, then who the hell was he? His breath was ragged. Lauren leaned forward, her voice desperate. "Brandon, Vanessa stole everything from you. She stole me. She stole our son." Brandon squeezed his eyes shut. Flashes of memories, blurred, distant, almost unreachable, flickered through his mind. Lauren laughing on a summer afternoon, a crib in a brightly lit room, a baby's soft cry, his arms reaching out, but empty. His breath hitched. "No," he muttered, standing up abruptly. "No, I can't." Lauren rose too, her voice stronger now. "You don't have to believe me, Brandon, but you have to question her." Brandon froze. The sharpest, most painful realization of all hit him like a tidal wave. He had never questioned Vanessa. Not once. Not when she told him she had found him drifting in the ocean. Not when she told him he had no family. Not when she had given him a new name, a new life, a new past. His hands shook, because now he saw it. Not just the holes in his memory, but the carefully placed illusions Vanessa had fed him. She had shaped his entire life to fit her story, and he had believed it. Brandon turned to Lauren, his heart pounding. "If what you're saying is true," his voice broke. He swallowed hard. "If Caleb is our son," Lauren's face was pleading, "then we have to get him back." Brandon ran a shaking hand through his hair. He was so close to breaking through, but there was one thing still holding him back. "If Vanessa did all of this," he said carefully, his voice barely a whisper, "then how do I know she won't try to stop me from leaving?" Lauren's face went pale, because she knew the answer. Vanessa wouldn't just stop him. She would destroy him, and worse, she would never let them near Caleb again. Brandon sat back down, his face buried in his hands. He couldn't just walk into that house and demand answers. He had spent 7 years living a lie, and now he had to play the game carefully. If he made one wrong move, Vanessa would bury the truth deeper than ever. Lauren's voice was soft but unwavering. "We need to be smart," she said. "You need to make her think you still believe her." Brandon's stomach twisted, because now he was seeing Vanessa for what she really was. A liar, a manipulator, a thief, a woman who had stolen his son. A woman who had stolen his life. He exhaled, his chest tight with rage. "All right," he murmured. "I'll go back." Lauren's lips parted. "Brandon." He looked at her, his blue eyes sharper than ever. "I'll go back," he repeated, "but not as her puppet. Lauren sucked in a breath because there, in his face, she saw it. The man she had loved, the man she had lost, and now, the man who was ready to fight. Brandon sat in his car outside Lauren's apartment, gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping him anchored to reality. He wasn't the man he thought he was. Everything, his past, his name, his son, had been built on Vanessa's lies. And now, he was going back into the lion's den. But this time, he wasn't her puppet. This time, he was going to take her down. Lauren stood beside his car, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, as if trying to hold in all the pain, all the years of suffering. "You don't have to do this alone," she said softly. Brandon met her gaze, his chest aching. "I do," he said. "If she knows I'm doubting her, she'll shut me out. I have to make her believe I'm still on her side." Lauren swallowed hard. "What if she realizes what you're doing?" Brandon's hands clenched. "Then I'll make sure she never sees it coming." Back at the mansion, Brandon stepped inside, forcing his expression to stay calm. Unreadable. Vanessa was waiting. She was always waiting. She stood at the top of the stairs, a picture of control, her silk robe draped over her like royalty. "You left in a hurry this morning," she said, her voice too sweet, too careful. Brandon shrugged, keeping his tone casual. "Needed some air." Vanessa studied him for a long moment, then descended the staircase slowly. "Air," she echoed, stepping closer. "And did you find what you were looking for?" Brandon's stomach twisted. She was testing him. He forced a smirk. "I found clarity." Vanessa's lips curved slightly. "Good." She reached up, smoothing his tie, her nails trailing against the fabric. "I was worried for a moment," she murmured, "that she might have gotten inside your head." Brandon kept his breathing steady. Lauren had gotten inside his head. She had woken him up, but Vanessa couldn't know that, so he played the role one last time. He let out a dry chuckle. "Lauren, she's just another woman looking for a payout." Vanessa's gaze narrowed, calculating, assessing. Then, after a long pause, she smiled, a slow, satisfied, dangerous smile. "I knew you'd see the truth," she whispered. Brandon forced himself to smile back, but inside, his blood was boiling. The next morning, Vanessa was in the sunroom, drinking coffee while scrolling through her tablet. Brandon had been waiting for this moment. "Vanessa?" he said, his voice calm, controlled. "I want to see Caleb's adoption records." She froze. It was subtle, just a flicker of hesitation, but he saw it. She recovered quickly, setting her tablet down with a graceful tilt of her head. "Why would you need to do that?" Brandon shrugged. "I was thinking about legal security, making sure everything is in order." Vanessa smiled, but it was too sharp, too rehearsed. "Everything is perfectly in order, darling," she said smoothly. Brandon leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Then show me." A crack, a small one, but it was there. Vanessa's smile tightened. "Brandon, don't be ridiculous. You're his father. You don't need to go digging through paperwork." His pulse quickened. She was stalling, which meant she was hiding something. Brandon chuckled. "I know I don't need to. I just want to." Vanessa's eyes darkened, but she masked it with another smile. "I'll have the records sent to your office later," she said breezily. Brandon didn't believe her for a second. She would never send them, because if he saw them, she would lose everything. And now, she knew that he was starting to pull away. Brandon needed to act fast, because Vanessa was about to strike first. That night, Brandon tucked Caleb into bed, watching as the little boy yawned, his small fingers gripping his blanket. "Dad?" Brandon swallowed hard. "Yeah, buddy." Caleb blinked sleepily. Why did Miss Lauren leave? Brandon's heart stopped. He had expected this question, dreaded it. He ran a hand over Caleb's hair, forcing his voice to stay steady. "She had to go, kiddo." Caleb frowned. "I liked her." Brandon's throat tightened. "Me too," he admitted. Caleb yawned again, his eyelids drooping. "I hope she comes back." Brandon exhaled. "So do I, kid. So do I." Brandon waited until the house was quiet. Then, he slipped into Vanessa's office. He had one goal: find the adoption records before she destroyed them. He rummaged through drawers. Cabinets. Nothing then. A small safe tucked beneath her desk. Brandon's pulse spiked. This was it. He knelt down, trying to guess the code. Vanessa was predictable. She liked control. She liked patterns. He tried her birthday. Nothing. He tried their wedding date. Still nothing then, on impulse. He tried Caleb's birthday. Click. Brandon's breath hitched. The safe unlocked. He pulled it open, and his blood ran cold. Inside were two things: a thick folder labeled C. Blackwood, Private Files, and a small vial filled with white powder. Brandon's pulse roared in his ears. This wasn't just fraud. This was something much worse. Vanessa hadn't just stolen his son. She was capable of much, much more. And now he had proof, but before he could grab it, a voice cut through the darkness. "What are you doing, Brandon?" Brandon's stomach dropped. He turned slowly. Vanessa stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her eyes icy and unreadable. But beneath that controlled exterior, he saw it. Rage, fear, desperation. She knew. Brandon clenched his jaw. The game was over. It was time for the final battle. Brandon's pulse thundered in his ears. Vanessa stood in the doorway, her silhouette dark against the dim office light, her expression eerily calm. But he saw it. The fear, the rage, the unraveling. She knew. She knew that he had finally seen through her lies. Brandon straightened, slowly closing the safe, his hands steady even though his heart was racing. "I was looking for answers," he said evenly. Vanessa's lips curled into a smile, but it was all teeth, all warning. "Oh, darling," she murmured, stepping inside. "You already have all the answers you need." Brandon clenched his jaw. "Then why hide them?" Vanessa tilted her head, her eyes sharp as a blade. "Because some things are better left. Buried." Brandon's chest ached with fury. She wasn't even trying to deny it anymore. She knew he was slipping away, and she was trying to reel him back in. Not this time. Brandon exhaled, shaking his head. "You stole Caleb from his mother." Vanessa's smile froze. Brandon saw it, the flicker of true panic beneath the carefully constructed mask. For the first time, she wasn't in control. "You sound ridiculous," she said. Her voice clipped. Brandon took a step forward. "You took my life, Vanessa. You made me believe I had no past. You fed me lie after lie, and I believed you." Vanessa's jaw tightened. Brandon let out a bitter chuckle. "Hell, you probably wanted me dead, didn't you?" That did it. Her expression cracked. It was a fleeting moment, a flicker of truth in her eyes before she masked it again. Brandon's stomach turned. She hadn't just stolen his past. She had tried to erase him from existence. Vanessa's lips parted, but before she could speak, Brandon grabbed the folder from the safe. He held it up, his voice steady, unshakable. "This is proof, isn't it?" he said. His eyes locked onto hers. "Proof that Caleb was never yours." Vanessa took a slow, measured breath. Then, she laughed, a soft, chilling laugh. Brandon's stomach twisted because it wasn't the laugh of a woman who was caught. It was the laugh of a woman who still had one last card to play. "You poor thing," she whispered, stepping closer. "You really think this will change anything?" Brandon didn't answer. Vanessa's smile widened. "Even if you have those documents," she continued, "who do you think people will believe?" His hands tightened around the folder. Vanessa circled him, her voice silk and venom. "You've been legally dead for years, Brandon. Your name is a ghost. The world sees me as your devoted wife, the woman who saved you from the depths of the ocean." Brandon's breath was shallow. She was right. For years, she had crafted a perfect lie. She had built an empire of deception, and the world had bought it. But she had underestimated one thing. Brandon was done playing her game. He turned to face her, his expression cold as steel. "Then I'll destroy you first." Vanessa understood the threat. That's why, over the next 2 days, she watched him like a hawk. Brandon played the role one last time. He kissed her cheek in the morning. He acted like the devoted, obedient husband she had shaped him into. But beneath the surface, he was planning her downfall. Lauren and Detective Harrison were already working to unseal the adoption records. Brandon had copied every document in that safe, ensuring Vanessa couldn't destroy them. And now, all he had to do was make sure she didn't see it coming. On the third night, Vanessa made her move. Brandon had been expecting it. He was in his office when she walked in, holding a glass of whiskey, her smile too bright. I thought we could celebrate, she purred, handing him the glass. Brandon took it, pretending not to notice the way her eyes flickered to watch him drink. He didn't. Instead, he set it down on the desk. Not in the mood? Vanessa's smile dimmed. For the first time in 7 years, Brandon felt like he was the one in control. And Vanessa, she hated it. You're different, she murmured. Stepping closer, I don't like it. Brandon exhaled. I wonder why. Vanessa's eyes flashed with something dark. I loved you, she whispered, trailing a hand down his chest. I built a life for us. Brandon grabbed her wrist, stopping her. No, Vanessa. His voice was ice. You built a prison. Her body stiffened. And there it was, the final fracture in her mask. She pulled back, her face twisting with pure fury. You're making a mistake, Brandon, she hissed. Brandon tilted his head. I think you made yours a long time ago. Vanessa's fingers clenched at her sides. And in that moment, Brandon saw it. The moment she realized she had lost him. For good. That night, after Vanessa went to bed, Brandon slipped into Caleb's room. The little boy was fast asleep, his chest rising and falling peacefully. Brandon knelt beside him, his heart aching. I'm going to fix this, he whispered. I promise, Caleb murmured in his sleep, rolling over. Brandon swallowed hard. He was running out of time because now, Vanessa was dangerous. Now, she was desperate, and desperate people did terrible things. Brandon didn't sleep that night. He sat in his office, staring at the documents spread out in front of him, his mind racing. He had everything he needed. Proof of Vanessa's deception. Evidence of Caleb's true identity. The next step was exposing her. But Vanessa wasn't going to let that happen easily. She knew. She had seen it in his eyes, in his refusal to drink the whiskey she had so carefully prepared for him. She knew he was slipping away, and now she would do whatever it took to stop him. The next morning, Brandon found Caleb sitting alone at the breakfast table, his small hands fidgeting with his spoon. Vanessa was nowhere in sight. Hey, buddy, Brandon said, ruffling his son's hair before sitting beside him. Where's Vanessa? Caleb shrugged. She left early. Said she had something important to do. Brandon's stomach clenched. Vanessa never left without making a grand show of it. She was up to something, and whatever it wasn't good. By noon, Brandon's worst fear was confirmed. Lauren called. He picked up immediately. Lauren. Her voice was shaky, frantic. Brandon, Vanessa was here. His grip tightened on the phone. What? She came to my apartment, Lauren said, her breath uneven. She wasn't even trying to hide it. She said she knew we were working together. Brandon's heart pounded. Did she threaten you? A pause, then. She told me I'll never see Caleb again. Brandon felt a cold, raw fury settle in his chest. Vanessa was cornered, and now she was lashing out. She's desperate, Lauren continued. I don't know what she's planning, but I know it's bad. Brandon exhaled sharply. We're running out of time. Lauren's voice was stronger now. Then we have to act now. Brandon nodded, his jaw tight with determination. Meet me in an hour. He hung up, his entire body humming with adrenaline. He had waited too long. Vanessa had stolen 7 years from him. She wasn't going to steal another day. Brandon met Lauren and Detective Harrison at a secluded cafe downtown. Harrison wasted no time. The court petition to unseal the adoption records is already in motion. We'll have a judge review it within 48 hours. Brandon frowned. That's too long. Harrison sighed. I know, but the law is slow. Even when we have undeniable proof. Brandon clenched his fists. He didn't have 48 hours. Vanessa was already making her move. I need to get Caleb out of that house before she does something drastic, Brandon said. Lauren swallowed hard. How? Brandon's mind was racing. Then, an idea. A risky, reckless, dangerous idea. But it was the only way. He turned to Harrison. What happens if a minor is in immediate danger? Harrison narrowed his eyes. Depends. Why? Brandon exhaled. Because Vanessa is capable of anything. She's already lied to keep Caleb. If we prove she's a threat, if we prove she's unstable, the court will have no choice but to intervene. Harrison's eyes flickered with understanding. You want her to make a mistake. Brandon nodded. I want her to show her true colors. Lauren bit her lip. And what if she doesn't? Brandon's expression was hard. Determined, she will. That night, Brandon returned home pretending nothing had changed. He sat through dinner with Vanessa, watching as she carried herself with practiced elegance, sipping her wine as if she hadn't threatened the mother of his child that very morning. She was too confident, too certain that she still had control over him. She had no idea what was coming. After dinner, Brandon tucked Caleb into bed. "Hey, buddy," he said softly, kneeling beside him. "How about we go on an adventure tomorrow?" Caleb's sleepy eyes lit up. "Like where?" Brandon smiled. "Somewhere safe." Caleb yawned, nodding. "Okay, Dad." Brandon's chest tightened. Tomorrow, everything would change. At midnight, Vanessa made her move. Brandon was in his office when she walked in, her silk robe flowing around her like armor. "I know what you're doing," she said, her voice cold as ice. Brandon leaned back in his chair, playing along. "And what's that?" Vanessa's eyes glinted with malice. "You're trying to take him from me." Brandon's blood boiled. She was still acting like Caleb was hers, like she had some twisted right to him. "I'm his father," Brandon said, his voice controlled but sharp. Vanessa's jaw tightened. "You're my husband," Brandon laughed darkly. "Was I, or was I just a pawn in your game?" Vanessa's lips curled in a sneer. "You were mine." Brandon stood slowly. "Not anymore." For the first time, Vanessa looked truly afraid. She stepped closer, lowering her voice to a dangerous whisper. "You have no idea what I'm capable of, Brandon." He held her gaze, unflinching. "Oh, I do." He turned, walking toward the door. But then, her hand shot out. Gripping his wrist tightly, Brandon stilled. When he turned, Vanessa's eyes were wild, unhinged, and then she whispered the words that sent a chill through his bones. "If I can't have you." Her fingers dug into his skin. "Then no one will." Brandon's stomach dropped. Vanessa's mask had completely shattered. And now, she was about to show the world exactly what she was capable of. Brandon's pulse thundered in his ears. Vanessa's fingers dug into his wrist, her nails pressing against his skin like a silent warning. "If I can't have you, then no one will." Her voice was a whisper, but it carried every ounce of venom she had left. Brandon forced himself to stay calm, unreadable, because this was it. Vanessa had finally cracked. And now, he'd just had to make sure she destroyed herself completely. He exhaled, prying her grip off his arm with measured patience. "You're losing control." Vanessa let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "You think this is me losing control?" Her eyes glinted with something dark. Unhinged then, she smiled. A slow, dangerous smile, and Brandon's stomach dropped because Vanessa wasn't just angry. She was planning something, and that made her more dangerous than ever. The next morning, Brandon executed his plan. He packed a small bag, tucked Caleb's favorite stuffed dinosaur inside, and told his son they were going on a secret adventure. Caleb's face lit up. "Just us." Brandon smiled. "Just us." He had to get Caleb out before Vanessa realized what was happening, and he had to do it fast. But Vanessa was one step ahead. Brandon had just finished loading the last of Caleb's things into the car when he saw them. 2 security guards. Standing by the driveway, waiting. Brandon's breath hitched. Then, the front door creaked open. Vanessa stepped outside, arms crossed, her expression calm and victorious. "I had a feeling you'd try something like this," she said smoothly. Brandon's blood boiled. She had been watching, waiting, and now, she was making sure he couldn't leave. Brandon clenched his jaw. "Get out of my way." Vanessa let out a mocking sigh. "Oh, Brandon, you're acting so impulsive." She motioned to the guards. "Escort him back inside." Brandon's hands fisted at his sides. Caleb peeked out from behind him, his small face filled with confusion and fear. "Dad!" Brandon's chest ached. He had promised Caleb an adventure, but now Vanessa was turning it into a nightmare. Brandon wouldn't let that happen. Not again. Thinking fast, he switched tactics. He exhaled sharply, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Fine, let's talk." Vanessa's eyes narrowed. "Talk." Brandon forced a smirk. "That's what you want, right? For me to come back inside, sit down, and listen to you." Vanessa's lips curved slightly. She thought she was winning. Brandon took a step closer, lowering his voice. "But if you really want me to believe you, then prove it." Vanessa tilted her head. Prove what? Brandon's expression turned cold, sharp. Prove that Caleb is really yours. For a split second, her mask slipped. It was fast. Just a flicker of unease, panic. But Brandon caught it. Vanessa covered it up quickly, letting out a short laugh. Brandon, darling, this is ridiculous. Brandon took another step forward, forcing her to hold his gaze. If you have nothing to hide, he said carefully, then let's take a DNA test. Vanessa stilled, and that was it. That was all the proof Brandon needed. She didn't expect him to push this far. She didn't expect him to fight back, and now she had no way out. Vanessa tried one last trick. She sighed dramatically, shaking her head. I can't believe you'd put Caleb through that. He's just a child. Do you really want to confuse him with unnecessary tests? Brandon's jaw tightened. She was still playing the victim, still pretending to care. But he saw her for what she was now, and he wasn't falling for it. You're right, he said slowly. Caleb doesn't need to be confused. Vanessa smiled. Too soon. But the law doesn't care about confusion, Brandon added, his voice ice cold. And as of yesterday, a court order is already in motion to unseal his adoption records. Vanessa's smile vanished. Brandon's heart pounded in triumph. Because now she was panicking. The guards shifted uneasily, glancing at each other. Brandon kept going, pressing the knife deeper. Once those records are unsealed, he continued, everyone will know what you did. Vanessa's eyes darkened. And that's when Brandon realized something chilling. She wasn't just angry. She was desperate, and desperate people were dangerous. That night, Brandon didn't sleep. He stayed awake, sitting in the dark, waiting, because he knew Vanessa wasn't going to give up without a fight. She was cornered, and when an animal was cornered, it attacked. So Brandon waited for her next move. And then, at 2 a.m., he heard it, the sound of a car engine starting. Brandon's heart stopped. He rushed to the window, just in time to see Vanessa's car speeding away. But she wasn't alone. Brandon's chest tightened in horror, because in the back seat was Caleb. Brandon's heart stopped. Vanessa's car sped down the driveway, taillights glowing like a pair of distant demons in the dark, and in the back seat, Caleb, his son. Brandon's stomach twisted, panic flooding his veins like fire. He bolted, didn't think, didn't hesitate. He grabbed his car keys from the table and raced outside, his bare feet barely feeling the cold pavement as he jumped into his SUV. The tires screeched against the pavement as he threw the car into reverse, then sped forward, chasing after Vanessa's fading taillights. She was running, and she had his son. Not this time. Brandon's fingers clenched around the steering wheel as he pushed the gas harder, the SUV roaring through the empty night streets. Vanessa was reckless behind the wheel, her car swerving across lanes as she tried to lose him. But Brandon knew her, knew how she thought. She wasn't driving toward the airport, not toward the city. She was heading somewhere hidden, somewhere she thought he wouldn't find her. Brandon's jaw tightened. She was wrong. Brandon dialed as he drove, the phone pressed to his ear. Harrison picked up on the first ring. What's wrong? She took Caleb, Brandon growled, his knuckles turning white on the wheel. She's on the run. A sharp curse on the other end. Where are you? Harrison barked. Heading west. Past the marina, Brandon said. She's driving like a maniac if we don't stop her. We will, Harrison cut in. I'm calling units now. Keep her in sight. Brandon's chest burned with fury. I'm not losing him again. Vanessa must have realized she wasn't shaking him, because she made a sudden, sharp turn off the main road, heading toward the cliffs by the ocean. Brandon's stomach dropped. No, no, no. She was heading toward the bluffs, steep, rocky drops straight into the crashing waves below. Brandon's grip tightened, his foot slamming the gas. She was going to do something crazy, and Caleb was in that car. He had to stop her. As Vanessa's car skidded to a stop near the cliff's edge, Brandon followed, tires screaming as he braked hard. The second his SUV stopped, he threw the door open and ran. Vanessa had already yanked Caleb out of the car, clutching him tightly against her chest. The little boy was crying, his small arms trying to push her away. Brandon's heart shattered at the sound. Let him go, he shouted, his voice raw with rage and fear. Vanessa took a step back, too close to the edge. The wind howled around them, the sound of the waves crashing violently below filling the night air. Brandon's breath hitched. She wouldn't, would she? Vanessa's eyes were wild, her hair whipping around her face. "I did everything for you," she screamed. Brandon took a step forward, hands raised, calm, controlled. He had to keep her talking, had to get Caleb away from her. "You lied to me," Brandon said carefully. "You stole my life. You stole my son." Vanessa's face twisted with rage. "I saved you," she shrieked. "You were nothing when I found you. I gave you everything, and you still chose her." Brandon's chest heaved. "You didn't save me," he said. "You trapped me." Vanessa shook her head violently, gripping Caleb tighter. The little boy sobbed, his small fists pounding against her arms. "Mommy," Caleb cried, his voice broken, desperate. "Lauren." Brandon's lungs squeezed. He had to get him away, now. "Vanessa, listen to me." Brandon tried again, his voice gentle now. "You don't have to do this." Vanessa let out a hysterical laugh. "Oh, Brandon," she whispered, her eyes gleaming with something dark. And then she took a step closer to the edge. Brandon's heart stopped. "No," he shouted, stepping forward. Vanessa's grip faltered for half a second, just long enough, and then a gunshot. The sound shattered the night, echoing through the cliffs. Vanessa's eyes widened in shock. Her fingers loosened, her body staggered, and then she fell. Brandon lunged forward, grabbing Caleb just in time, pulling his son into his arms as Vanessa's body disappeared over the edge. A sickening splash filled the silence, then nothing, just the roar of the ocean swallowing her whole. Brandon held Caleb tightly against his chest, his breath coming in shaky gasps. The little boy was sobbing, trembling. Brandon buried his face in his son's hair, his entire body shaking with relief and fear. "It's okay," he whispered. "You're safe now. I've got you." Caleb hiccuped against his chest. "Daddy." Brandon's throat tightened. He hadn't heard Caleb call him that before. Not until now. He pulled back, pressing a kiss to his son's forehead. "I'm right here," he promised. "I'll never let anyone take you away again." Police sirens wailed in the distance. Brandon turned just as Detective Harrison's car skidded onto the dirt road. Red and blue lights flashing wildly. Harrison jumped out, gun still drawn. "Where is she?" Brandon swallowed hard, glancing at the dark waves below. "Gone." Harrison followed his gaze, exhaling sharply. "Damn." Brandon's arms tightened around Caleb. "It's over," he whispered. Harrison nodded. "No," he said. "It's just beginning." Because now, Brandon could finally take back his life, and Caleb could finally go home. Brandon sat on the hospital chair, his hands gently clasped around Caleb's small ones. His son, his real son. The morning light filtered through the windows, casting a warm glow on the hospital room. Caleb was sleeping soundly, his face peaceful, despite the chaos of the night before. Brandon still couldn't believe it was over. Vanessa was gone. The woman who had stolen his life, manipulated his memories, and taken his son. She had finally lost. And yet, Brandon didn't feel relief. Not yet. Because there was still one last thing he needed to do. A soft knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. Brandon looked up, his heart clenching as Lauren stepped inside. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, her eyes flickered to Caleb, still asleep in the hospital bed. She covered her mouth with her hand, her body trembling with raw emotion. Brandon stood slowly, stepping toward her. "He's okay," he whispered. Lauren let out a shaky breath. I can't believe this." Brandon reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining like they were meant to fit together. "He knows, Lauren," Brandon said softly. "Last night he called you Mommy in his sleep." Lauren's breath hitched. Tears spilled down her cheeks. He remembers." Brandon nodded. "Maybe not everything, but he knows you. And he needs you." Lauren squeezed his hand. "I need him too." Brandon's chest ached. He had spent 7 years believing he had no family. Now, standing here, watching Lauren gaze at their son like she had just found her heart again, he knew they had always been meant to find their way back. Hours later, Caleb woke up. His sleepy eyes blinked open, searching the room, until they landed on Lauren, his small face scrunched in confusion. "Miss Lauren." Lauren swallowed hard, kneeling beside him. "Hi, sweetheart." Caleb looked up at Brandon, his brows furrowed. "Daddy, why is she here?" Brandon's heart tightened. This was it. He knelt beside them, taking Caleb's tiny hands in his. "Because, buddy," Brandon said gently, "I need to tell you something really important." Caleb blinked at him. "What?" Brandon took a deep breath. "Miss Lauren isn't just someone who took care of you." Caleb frowned. "She's not." Brandon shook his head, squeezing his son's hands. "She's your real mom, Caleb." Silence. Lauren held her breath. Caleb's small face twisted with confusion. But Vanessa was my mom." Brandon's chest ached. "No, buddy, she wasn't." Caleb's little hands trembled. "But she told me she was." Lauren's voice was barely a whisper. "She lied to you, sweetheart." Caleb shook his head, trying to understand. Brandon's voice remained soft, steady. "You were taken from us when you were a baby. Vanessa raised you." "But she wasn't really your mom." Caleb's lower lip quivered. Brandon's heart broke. Caleb looked at Lauren again, studying her face like he was seeing her for the first time. Something flickered in his little brown eyes. "You were looking for me, weren't you?" he whispered. Tears streamed down Lauren's cheeks. Every single day, Caleb's tiny hands reached out for her. And Lauren broke completely. She pulled him into her arms, pressing kisses into his hair, whispering words he probably didn't fully understand but felt deep in his heart. Brandon swallowed hard, his own eyes burning with emotion. This was it. The moment Vanessa had tried to steal from them. The moment where they became a family again. The next few weeks were about healing. Lauren moved into a temporary apartment near Brandon's, giving Caleb time to adjust. Brandon relearned what it meant to be a father. To wake up in the morning and hear his son laughing in the kitchen. To see Lauren and Caleb building a connection that never should have been stolen in the first place. It wasn't always easy. There were hard nights. Nights when Caleb cried, confused about the changes. Nights when he asked about Vanessa, and Brandon had to explain carefully, gently, but together. They were getting through it. Together one evening, Brandon stood on his balcony, looking out at the ocean. Lauren joined him, wrapping her arms around herself against the cool breeze. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked. Brandon smiled slightly. "I was just thinking about how much has changed." Lauren leaned against the railing. "Do you regret remembering?" Brandon turned to her, his blue eyes soft, filled with something deep and unbreakable. "No," he said, "because remembering brought me back to you." Lauren's breath caught. Brandon reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together. "I lost you once," he whispered. "I'm never losing you again." Lauren's heart pounded. And then, slowly, she rose onto her toes and kissed him. Soft, tender, a promise. The past was behind them, but the future was theirs to create. Months later, Lauren, Brandon, and Caleb stood outside a small farmhouse in the Texas countryside. A fresh start, a home that wasn't built on lies, but on love. Caleb ran ahead, giggling as he chased a butterfly across the yard. Lauren turned to Brandon, smiling. "Are you sure about this?" Brandon wrapped an arm around her waist. "More than I've ever been about anything." Lauren leaned against him, exhaling softly. They had been through hell and back. But they had survived together. And now, they weren't just starting over. They were finally home.